1964, Missouri. The steep slopes of the Ozark Mountains were cloaked in a thick fog when James Harrington, a ranger with the United States Forest Service, ventured into a previously unexplored area. His mission, to conduct a survey to map potential lands for the expansion of Mark Twain National Forest, a routine job that would, inadvertently, bring to light one of the most disturbing cases of familial consanguinity and isolation ever documented in the state. I was following the course of an unmapped stream when I noticed signs of human occupation. First, a rudimentary fence, then smoke rising through the trees, and finally a clearing with several structures that weren't on any official record, Harrington reported in his testimony to the Shannon County Department of Social Services. That document was sealed for nearly 3 decades following the incident. Harrington managed to exit the property without a confrontation. He immediately reported his discovery to county authorities. His training in biology enabled him to recognize the clear signs of genetic problems among the family members he had briefly observed, a pattern he correctly associated with possible consanguinity. It wasn't just a family living outside the system, Harrington later explained in a 1990 interview for the Missouri Department of Conservation. It was a family that seemed to be physically deteriorating due to genetic isolation. As a public official, I felt I couldn't simply ignore it, even while respecting people's right to live as they choose. What the forest ranger found in that isolated clearing, located more than 30 kilometers from the nearest community, defied any emotional preparation. An entire family, later identified as the O'Learys, had been living in complete isolation from the outside world for a minimum of 4 generations. Yet, it wasn't solely the geographic isolation that made the case so alarming. There were children with visible deformities, adults with almost identical facial features, and their own language that I could barely understand, Harrington continued in his account. When I identified myself as a government employee, the older man just pointed a shotgun in my direction and said something like, "No stranger brings anything good." The Ozark Mountains, with their dense vegetation and rugged topography, have historically sheltered isolated communities. However, the case of the Holloway family transcended typical American rural isolation. Subsequent investigations would uncover a closed family system where unions between siblings, uncles, and nieces, and cousins had become the norm for more than 70 years. Dr. Robert Fielding, the rural physician who was the first professional to examine some family members after the discovery, wrote in his personal notes, "In 27 years of medicine in rural communities, I have never witnessed such a concentration of genetic anomalies in a single family group. Consanguinity here is not occasional, but systemic and multi-generational." Official county records, consulted after the discovery, showed only vague indications of the family's existence: a 1887 birth certificate for one Jeremiah Holloway, a few sparse mentions in early century censuses, and then nothing. It was as if the family had simply vanished from the records, though in reality they were retreating deeper into the mountains and into their own isolation. Those children never attended schools. Some adults barely knew there had been a world war or who was president, reported social worker Mary Carpenter, who participated in the first interventions. But the most disturbing thing was how they viewed their own situation as normal. For them, the outside world was the aberration. Local authorities soon found themselves facing an unprecedented legal and ethical dilemma. How could they intervene in a family that had existed this way for generations? What would be the results of a forced separation? And, perhaps most crucial, how could such an extreme situation have remained invisible in the mid-20th century? The answers to these questions would only begin to surface when investigators managed to reconstruct the history of the Holloways, a saga originating in the late 19th century that reveals as much about the geographic isolation of the Ozark Mountains as it does about the institutional failures that allowed an entire family to vanish from society's view. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Stories like the Holloways rarely reach public knowledge with all the original details preserved. You won't find this anywhere else. The Roots of Isolation, 1881 to 1900. The history of the Holloways in the depths of the Ozark Mountains officially commences in 1881. That year, Jeremiah Holloway, then 22, purchased 120 acres of remote land in what is now Shannon County, Missouri. Records from the time, preserved in the State Historical Archive, show that Jeremiah paid a negligible amount for the property, land considered of little worth due to its rugged terrain and extremely difficult access. What the documents don't clarify is the reason that drove Jeremiah to seek such isolation. Interviews with elderly residents of neighboring communities, conducted after the family's discovery in 1964, proposed that Jeremiah may have been fleeing criminal charges in Kentucky. A letter found among the family's possessions, dated 1882, offers some clues. "No one will find us here. We can live according to our own laws, away from the eyes of those who do not understand our way of life." Jeremiah didn't arrive alone. He brought his young wife Eliza, his younger sister Constance, and 2 male cousins, Thaddeus and Isaiah. This initial family configuration would be vital to understanding what transpired in the decades that followed. The location Jeremiah selected for his property was strategically isolated, even by the standards of the era. Situated in a narrow valley encircled by steep elevations on all sides, access was only possible via a precarious trail that became impossible during the winter months. Dr. Wallace Humphrey, a geographer who studied the region in the 1970s, described the location as an extreme case of intentional geographic isolation, where every natural feature functioned as an additional barrier to external contact. Between 1883 and 1890, parish records from the distant Pine Grove Baptist Church show that Jeremiah occasionally came down to the community to acquire essential supplies. Pastor Jonathan Miller, who kept a meticulous diary, described Jeremiah as a distrustful and reserved man who spoke little and, despite repeated invitations, never brought his family to Sunday gatherings. The last mention of a visit by Jeremiah to the community dates from April 1890. After that, the Holloways seem to have severed almost all contact with the outside world. Coincidentally, it was during this same period that the family's genetic isolation began to take hold. Documents found on the property after the 1964 discovery revealed that around 1892, Jeremiah Holloway had formalized a union between his cousin Isaiah and his sister Constance. 2 years later, his own eldest daughter, then just 14 years old, was given in marriage to the other cousin, Thaddeus, who was 32. A diary belonging to Eliza Holloway, Jeremiah's wife, offers a disturbing insight into the mentality that was starting to form. Jeremiah says that pure blood must remain pure, that the families in the valley are weak because they mix their blood with strangers. "I pray that the Lord guides us, for I fear for the future of our children." By 1900, the Holloways had developed a small, self-sufficient community. They raised pigs and chickens, grew corn, beans, and potatoes on terraces on the slopes, and hunted and fished in the nearby streams and forests. They built more cabins as the family expanded, always staying within the confines of the original property. An official 1900 census briefly records the presence of approximately 15 individuals on the Holloway property. However, the census taker noted that complete access to the dwellings was not permitted and that the head of the family showed extreme hostility to government presence. It was likely the last time any official representative set foot on the property until the 1964 discovery. Deepening the isolation, 1900 to 1964. The Holloways' geographic isolation was further reinforced by historical events. The Great Depression of 1929 economically devastated the region, causing many families to abandon their rural properties. The Ozark Mountains area, already sparsely populated, became even more deserted. During World War II, fuel restrictions and rationing further reduced traffic in remote areas. It was a period when many rural communities were forgotten by the authorities, explained local historian Timothy Warren in a 1970 article about the case. If a family was already living intentionally isolated, the combination of economic depression and war created the perfect environment for them to completely disappear from the records. And that is precisely what happened with the Holloways. As the decades advanced, the family grew more numerous, more endogamous, and more isolated. Any formal education was replaced by a rigid oral tradition. A belief system, a mix of religious elements, superstitions, and justifications for consanguinity, solidified through the generations. They believed the outside world was contaminated, revealed EMTT Holloway, one of the few members who successfully adapted to life outside the property after the 1964 intervention. Our elders taught that the family's blood was special, chosen, and that mixing it with strangers would bring weakness and disease. When James Harrington accidentally stumbled upon the property in 1964, he discovered more than just an isolated family. He found a social microcosm that had evolved separately for almost 8 decades, with profound social and genetic consequences that were only beginning to be understood. The discovery and medical shock. When authorities finally gained full access to the Holloway property in October 1964, after weeks of tense negotiations, what they discovered shocked even the most seasoned professionals. The family had swelled to approximately 42 individuals, spanning 3 living generations, all direct descendants of the 5 original members who settled the property in the late 19th century. Dr. Malcolm Harrison, a geneticist from the University of Missouri called as a consultant on the case, documented his initial observations in a confidential report that only became public in 1991. The degree of genetic homogeneity observed in the Holloway family represents one of the most extreme cases of prolonged consanguinity ever documented in modern medical literature. Virtually all members exhibit some degree of manifestation of deleterious recessive characters. The technical language of the report concealed a disturbing reality. Among the 42 living members, 27 presented some type of cognitive or physical disability directly attributable to consanguinity. Severe facial deformities, fused fingers, syndactyly, congenital deafness, and various degrees of intellectual impairment were common, particularly among the youngest, clear evidence of the progressive accumulation of recessive genetic mutations over generations. Martha Holloway, one of the older women in the group, born around 1910, gave investigators details about the internal family structure. Her testimony, recorded on tapes and archived at the Missouri State Library, revealed a complex system of arranged unions with unsettling naturalness. When a girl bleeds for the first time, she is ready to marry. The Council of Elders decides who marries whom based on the family's strength lines. The full siblings don't marry each other, only half-siblings, because that was written in the rule book. The rule book mentioned was found in the main cabin, a leather-bound manuscript of over 200 pages, handwritten over decades by various family members. The document blended distorted elements of biblical texts, practical rules for life on the property, and elaborate genealogical records used to plan future unions, seemingly attempting to minimize certain specific types of consanguinity while promoting others. An anthropologist who studied the manuscript commented that the document revealed an instinctive, though primitive, understanding of genetic risks combined with mystical justifications for practices the outside community would deem incestuous. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Isolated ignorance can be the worst prison. Life within the microcosm. Daily life on the Holloway property was governed by rigid divisions of labor and routines based on physical ability and gender. Children began working as soon as they could walk, starting with household chores and progressing to heavier agricultural work as they grew. Formal education was non-existent, replaced by oral transmission of knowledge and practical learning. While some older members knew how to write and read rudimentarily, skills passed down from the founders, many of the younger ones were completely illiterate. Their vocabulary was limited, blending archaic English with unique, internally developed expressions. They had their own words to describe medical concepts they empirically recognized, observed linguist Dr. Caroline Foster, who studied the family's dialect. Terms like deep eyes and a weak blood were used to describe conditions we recognize as congenital microphthalmia and anemia. The family's diet, though sufficient in volume, was nutritionally deficient, relying primarily on seasonal wild foods, pork, beans, and corn. The absence of medical care resulted in high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Of the graves found in the small family cemetery, almost 60% belonged to children who did not survive to 5 years of age. Statistically, as generations progressed, the rate of early mortality and the proportion of births with complications increased, a classic pattern of inbreeding depression seen in populations with a high degree of consanguinity. Perhaps the most unsettling facet of the Holloway case was the normalization of disabilities and deformities within the community. For them, family traits were viewed not as pathological, but as distinctive marks of belonging. When questioned by social workers about her younger brother, who was born with severe malformations, Sarah Holloway, a 12-year-old girl, expressed confusion. "Why are you asking about Jacob? He's like that because he has strong family blood. The joined fingers show he's a true Holloway." This normalization, coupled with total isolation, explains why no family member ever sought external assistance, even in the most severe cases of illness or deformity. For them, the outside world was a threat, not a source of aid. The patriarch in 1964, Obadiah Holloway, grandson of Jeremiah, maintained rigid control over any outside contact. Interviews with younger members revealed that he frequently recounted terrifying stories about what happened to family people who got lost in the world of strangers, narratives that clearly served to discourage external contact or escapes. When authorities finally gained access to the property, they found a community that existed in almost complete self-sufficiency. They made their own clothes from wool and cotton, built tools and furniture using 19th-century methods, and preserved food using techniques like smoking and salting. They treated injuries and diseases with medicinal plants and practices that mixed superstition with empirical knowledge. It was like stepping into a time capsule, described Deputy Sheriff William Tanner, one of the first officers to enter the property. Except it wasn't just the way of life that seemed frozen in time. It was also the family's blood, recirculating and circulating in the same closed group for generations. The legal and ethical dilemma. The 1964 discovery of the Holloway family put Missouri authorities before an unprecedented dilemma. The complexity of the internal social system of the family, the severity of the health conditions, and the extent of the isolation demanded intervention, but the case raised deeply challenging legal, ethical, and practical questions. There was no protocol for a situation like this, Richard Donovan, then Shannon County prosecutor, admitted years later. We were simultaneously dealing with possible incest, medical neglect, and child abuse, but also with a community that had lived this way for decades with their own rules and with no apparent awareness of the illegality of their practices. The first phase of the intervention focused on emergency medical evaluations. A multidisciplinary team was assembled, including legal representatives, social workers, nurses, and doctors. In the first 72 hours after official access, 8 critical medical cases requiring immediate hospitalization were identified, primarily children with severe congenital conditions who had never received adequate treatment. West Plains Regional Hospital, the closest facility capable of handling complex cases, improvised a special ward to receive family members. Dr. Eleanina Simmons, medical director at the time, reported in an internal memo, "We are treating conditions that we would normally only see in textbooks. Some of these children present anomalies so rare that our specialists had to consult medical literature to correctly identify them." One of the most emblematic cases was Timothy Holloway, a 7-year-old boy with advanced craniosynosis, premature fusion of the skull bones that caused dangerous intracranial pressure and progressive visual impairment. The condition, treatable if diagnosed early, had reached a critical stage. Timothy underwent emergency surgery which, according to medical records, most likely saved his life, but it was too late to reverse all neurological damage. While the medical team managed the most urgent cases, judicial authorities confronted complex legal issues. Consanguinity was clearly illegal under Missouri law, but the marriages had occurred informally, without official records. Many family members lacked any legal documentation or even birth certificates. Judge Howard Brennan, assigned to oversee the case, initially chose a cautious approach. Rather than immediate criminal charges against the adults, he issued temporary protection orders for all minors and mandated comprehensive psychological evaluations before any decision on permanent custody. "We are dealing with people who in many ways do not understand our legal or social system," the judge wrote in his preliminary decision. "Before we apply the full force of the law, we need to determine the degree of capacity for moral discernment within this extremely isolated context." This approach drew criticism. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a scathing editorial questioning, "For how long did our society tolerate this abuse in the name of rural isolation? And now are we again failing these children by not holding the perpetrators accountable?" The separation of the family met with resistance. The older members, led by Obadiah Holloway, initially refused to cooperate with any intervention. The continuous presence of sheriff's officers on the property was required for several weeks. Even so, 3 teenagers attempted to return to the family property, escaping state custody and demonstrating the powerful bond they maintained with their way of life despite the objectively precarious conditions. Resolution and lasting legacy. The psychological evaluation of adult members revealed consistent patterns. Dr. Harold Freeman, a psychiatrist who led the evaluations, reported, We observed a combination of cognitive limitations resulting from both genetic factors and severe educational deprivation, associated with a rigid and isolated belief system that normalizes practices that mainstream society considers abusive. The question of legal capacity was particularly challenging. Many of the family's adults had significant cognitive deficiencies but had developed adaptive survival skills within their restricted environment. Determining who should be considered a victim and who could be legally held responsible for forced consanguinity practices became a complex and thin line. After months of judicial deliberations and evaluations, an intermediate solution was formulated. The youngest children, under 12, were placed in state custody with plans for eventual placement in foster homes or adoption. Teenagers were directed to special educational transition programs. Adults with severe cognitive deficiencies were referred to specialized care institutions. Only 5 adults were formally charged with crimes related to the promotion of incest and child abuse, all older men who constituted the so-called Council of Elders and who, according to other members' testimonies, were the primary individuals responsible for forcing and decreeing consanguineous marriages. Obadiah Holloway, then 67, was sentenced to 12 years in prison in 1965, though he served only 4 before dying in the Missouri State Penitentiary due to cardiac complications. His final testimonies, preserved in court archives, reveal a man unable to fully grasp the criminal nature of his actions. "We only did what had always been done to keep the family strong and safe from the corrupt world out there." The Holloway property presented another dilemma. Legally, it belonged to Jeremiah's descendants, but determining the succession line became practically impossible due to the complexity of family ties and the absence of documentation. In 1967, the state of Missouri finally acquired the property through an eminent domain process, with the deposited values placed in a trust fund for the benefit of former family members. The lands were later incorporated into the Mark Twain National Forest, a pragmatic decision that also served to gradually erase the physical evidence of the isolated community. Today, few visitors to the forest know that by walking certain trails, they are passing through the almost invisible ruins of one of the most genetically closed and isolated communities in recent American history. For the Holloway children integrated into society, the transition was extraordinarily difficult. Many presented not only cognitive and medical challenges but also profound cultural shock. Deborah Winters, a social worker who accompanied several of the children for years, wrote in her 1970 report, "Even after 5 years, some still manifest recurring nightmares about being taken by strangers. Concepts we consider basic, such as indoor bathrooms, television, or telephones, were initially met with fear and distrust." The Holloway case exposed systemic failures in social and health services for isolated rural communities. In direct response, the state of Missouri established the Rural Outreach Program in 1966, specifically designed to monitor and identify families in remote areas, ensuring access to basic health services, vaccination, and education. A continuing legacy. 60 years have passed since the discovery of the Holloway family in the depths of the Ozark Mountains, but the ripples of that case continue to resonate in medicine, in social policies, and more deeply, in the lives of their descendants and the survivors. Emma Holloway Patterson, who was only 5 when she was removed from the family property in 1964, is today one of the few former members who speaks openly about her experiences. Adopted by a family of teachers in Springfield, Missouri, Emma managed to overcome significant initial difficulties and eventually became a nurse, a professional choice she directly attributes to her personal history. "For a long time, I tried to forget where I came from," Emma confided in a rare 2010 interview to the Missouri Historical Review. "But I realized that my story, however painful it may be, contains important lessons about how communities can disappear from society's view and how children suffer when we allow that to happen." Of the 42 family members identified in 1964, follow-up records indicate that only 28 were alive in 1980 and fewer than 15 in 2000. The significantly reduced life expectancy, especially among those with more severe congenital anomalies, is a somber reminder of the lasting impact of extreme consanguinity. Timothy Holloway, the boy who underwent emergency cranial surgery, lived until the age of 32 in a specialized institution. His drawings, impressive visual representations of life memories on the property, were later published in a special volume by the University of Missouri and are considered valuable anthropological documents. His works, with often disturbing themes contrasting with vibrant colors, offer a unique perspective of life within the isolated community. Not all survivors found paths to adaptation. Records from the Missouri Department of Mental Health indicate that around 40% of adult family members who were institutionalized remained dependent on care for life. Others faced significant challenges of social integration, even after years of educational support and therapy. Michael Roberts, a retired social worker who worked with several family members for more than 2 decades, observes, "The Holloway case taught us that extreme isolation combined with consanguinity produces not only genetic effects, but also profound social and psychological effects that can persist for generations." Some of those who seemed less physically affected were, in fact, the ones who struggled most to build normal relationships outside the distorted family structure in which they were raised. The medical impact of the case extended far beyond the directly involved individuals. The extensive medical and genetic records collected from the Holloway family, always with protected identities, became study material in medical schools. The Ozark cohort study, initiated in 1970 and continuing today, tracks not only the original survivors but also their descendants, documenting how the genetic effects of prolonged consanguinity manifest through subsequent generations. Dr. Jennifer Lawson, a geneticist who has worked with the study since 1995, explains, "The data collected from the Holloway family has provided unique insights into more than 30 rare recessive conditions. In a very real sense, their suffering contributed to significant advances in modern genetic counseling and prenatal diagnosis. In the public policy and legal realm, the case catalyzed important changes. The Missouri's Rural Community Protection Act of 1967, directly inspired by the Holloway case, established protocols for regular monitoring of remote areas and educational verification requirements for all children, regardless of distance from urban centers. Decades later, experts recognize that the legislation likely prevented similar situations. The original Holloway property, now part of the National Forest, became the subject of debate among conservationists and historians. In 2008, a proposal to designate the site as a historical landmark was rejected after intense discussions about the ethics of preserving a site associated with so much human suffering. Today, only a small informative plaque, discreet and easily ignored by visitors, vaguely mentions that the area was inhabited by an isolated community until the mid-20th century. The family cemetery, however, was preserved and restored in 2012, with simple headstones replacing the original rudimentary markings, a compromise between respecting those who died there, many of whom were children who never knew any world beyond that isolated valley, and completely erasing history. For scholars of American social history, the Holloway case remains an instructive but extreme example of how cultural beliefs can interact with geographic isolation to create social microcosms that radically diverge from the norms of the broader society. Historian Dr. Catherine Henderson, author of Invisible Communities, Isolation and Identity in Rural America, argues, "What makes the Holloway case so significant is not just its extreme nature, but how it illustrates processes of genetic and cultural isolation that occurred on a smaller scale in many American rural regions. The line between legitimate cultural autonomy and harmful isolation is often blurred, and the case invites us to examine that border more carefully. Perhaps the most potent legacy of the case is its impact on public awareness of isolated communities. The Missouri Historical Society archives record a significant increase in reporting on forgotten populations in rural areas in the years following the Holloway discovery, a growing recognition that even in connected and modern America, there are pockets of isolation where people can fall through the cracks of social protection systems. The lessons of the Holloway case remain relevant today in a world where geographic inequalities in access to services continue to shape lives. As Emma Holloway Patterson noted in her final testimony, the distance that separated our family from the world wasn't just in miles. It was a distance created by institutional neglect, fear, and ignorance. And that's a distance that still exists in many places if we have the courage to look. If you watched this far, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched all the way through so I can get to know you and see who really follows the channel." Don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share with friends who are interested in real stories that have remained hidden for decades. Your views and engagement are what make it possible to continue bringing these forgotten cases to light.